In the summer of 1944, across the hedgerows and cratered fields of Normandy, German tank commanders encountered something they could not explain. American Sherman tanks were hitting them with an accuracy that defied everything they understood about armored warfare. The Germans had superior tanks, thicker armor, more powerful guns, better optics. They had experienced crews who had fought across 2 continents. They had doctrine, discipline, and the advantage of defensive positions. Yet somehow, impossibly, American tanks were scoring hits while moving at speed across rough terrain, striking before German crews could complete their carefully practiced firing sequences. The reports came in from multiple sectors, from different units, all describing the same phenomenon. American tanks that should have stopped to aim were engaging successfully on the move. German intelligence officers read these reports with skepticism. Tank gunnery required a stable platform. This was fundamental. A tank bouncing over uneven ground could not maintain accurate aim. Every army knew this. The Americans knew it too. Or so the Germans believed. What they did not know, what they could not have known, was that inside every Sherman turret sat a device that changed the rules of armored combat. A spinning gyroscope connected to hydraulic controls, constantly making microscopic adjustments to keep the gun barrel level even as the tank pitched and rolled beneath it. The Americans called it the Gyrostabilizer. It was classified technology, shared only with select Allied forces. And it was about to give American tank crews an edge that would save countless lives and fundamentally alter how tank battles unfolded across the battlefields of Europe and the Pacific. The story of this invisible advantage begins not on the battlefields of France, but in the industrial laboratories and proving grounds of the United States in the early years of the war. When America entered World War II in December 1941, its armored forces lagged behind those of Germany, Britain, and the Soviet Union. American tank designers faced a sobering reality. Their tanks were outmatched in almost every measurable category. The M4 Sherman, which would become the standard American medium tank, mounted a 75mm gun that was adequate but not exceptional. Its armor was sufficient against most threats at the time of its design, but German tank guns were growing more powerful with each new model. What American engineers understood, however, was that victory in armored warfare was not solely about bigger guns and thicker armor. It was also about fire control, crew efficiency, and the ability to engage targets quickly and accurately under combat conditions. This understanding led them to explore a technology that other nations had considered but rejected as too complex or unreliable for battlefield use. The gyrostabilizer concept emerged from naval applications. American warships had been experimenting with gyroscopic gun stabilizers to help anti-aircraft crews track fast-moving targets, while their ships rolled in heavy seas. The principle was elegant in its simplicity. A heavy flywheel spinning at thousands of revolutions per minute resisted any attempt to change its orientation. By connecting this gyroscope to sensors and hydraulic actuators, engineers could detect when a gun barrel tilted away from its intended position and automatically correct it. For naval guns, this meant maintaining aim despite the pitch and roll of the ship. For tanks, it could mean the same thing, maintaining aim despite the violent motion of a vehicle traversing combat terrain. The Westinghouse Electric Corporation took on the challenge of adapting this naval technology for tanks. The constraints were severe. The system had to be compact enough to fit inside an already crowded turret. It had to be robust enough to withstand the constant shock and vibration of tank operations. It had to be simple enough that tank crews with basic technical training could operate and maintain it. And it had to work reliably under the worst conditions imaginable: mud, dust, extreme temperatures, and the chaos of combat. By 1942, Westinghouse engineers had produced a working prototype designated the gun stabilizer M1. The system stabilized the gun in the vertical axis only, which was the most critical dimension for a moving tank. As the tank pitched forward and backward over terrain, the stabilizer automatically adjusted the gun's elevation to maintain the gunner's aim point. Horizontal traverse still required manual control, but keeping the vertical axis steady was the breakthrough that mattered. The device consisted of 3 main components working in concert. The gyroscope itself, spinning at 6,000 revolutions per minute, served as the reference that detected any deviation from the intended gun elevation. An electronic control system amplified the gyroscope's signals and determined the direction and magnitude of correction needed. Finally, hydraulic actuators connected to the gun's elevation mechanism provided the muscle to move the heavy gun barrel up or down to compensate for the tank's motion. The entire correction cycle happened dozens of times per second, far faster than any human gunner could react. To the crew, the effect appeared almost magical. The gun barrel remained steady on target, while the tank bucked and bounced beneath them. Testing at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland produced results that exceeded expectations. Tanks equipped with functioning stabilizers could achieve first-round hit probabilities of 40% at ranges up to 800 yards while moving at 15 miles per hour over moderately rough terrain. Tanks without stabilizers, attempting the same shots, achieved hit probabilities below 5%. The difference was not marginal. It was transformational. Even more significantly, the stabilizer dramatically reduced the time required to engage a target after stopping. Without stabilization, a tank crew had to wait several seconds after halting for the suspension to settle and the gun barrel to stop oscillating before they could aim accurately. With stabilization, the gun was already on target the instant the tracks stopped moving. This saved 3 to 4 seconds per engagement, and in tank combat, 3 seconds was often the difference between shooting first and dying first. The United States Army Ordnance Department approved the stabilizer for production and installation in all new Sherman tanks beginning in early 1943. By the time of the Normandy invasion in June 1944, thousands of Shermans equipped with stabilizers were in service with American armored units. The technology remained classified throughout the war. Tank crews received training on how to operate the system, but they were instructed not to discuss its existence with anyone outside their immediate unit. The classification was not merely about keeping a technical secret from the enemy. It was also about maintaining tactical surprise. If German forces did not know the stabilizer existed, they could not develop tactics or countermeasures to minimize its effectiveness. American commanders understood that the greatest advantage is one the enemy does not know to defend against. As American armored divisions prepared for the invasion of Europe, the stabilizer became integrated into their tactical doctrine, but in a way that left room for crew judgment and initiative. Official guidance encouraged crews to use the stabilizer when conditions permitted, but it was not mandatory. Some crews embraced the technology immediately, recognizing its potential to keep them alive. Others remained skeptical, their instincts telling them that firing while moving violated fundamental principles of marksmanship. This variation in adoption meant that the stabilizer's impact on combat effectiveness varied from unit to unit, depending largely on how much crews trusted the device and how aggressively their commanders encouraged its use. When American forces landed on the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944, the stage was set for the greatest test of armored warfare the world had yet seen. The bocage country of northern France, with its dense hedgerows, narrow lanes, and rolling terrain, created a close-quarters battle environment where engagements happened suddenly at short range. German forces, though outnumbered and increasingly short on fuel and ammunition, fought with the skill and determination of veterans. Their defensive tactics exploited the terrain masterfully. Panzer and tank destroyer units positioned themselves in hull-down positions behind hedgerows or slight rises in the ground, showing only their turrets while their hulls remained protected. From these positions, they could wait for American armor to advance into predetermined kill zones, then engage with devastating accuracy. The tactical advantage lay with the defender, and German crews knew how to maximize it. They would identify a target, ensure their tank was stationary, and their gun laid precisely, then fire. Against conventional opponents who had to stop to return fire accurately, this method proved brutally effective. But the Shermans were not conventional opponents. In the fields south of Corentin, a platoon of 5 Sherman tanks from the 2nd Armored Division advanced across open ground toward a tree line where German intelligence had reported enemy armor. The platoon leader, a young lieutenant from Pennsylvania who had been in France for less than 2 weeks, scanned the tree line through his binoculars. The hedgerow looked like every other hedgerow they had passed, a thick tangle of earth, roots, and vegetation that could hide anything. His instinct told him something was waiting there. He gave the order for the platoon to deploy into a skirmish line and maintain speed. Standard doctrine would have called for the tanks to halt before reaching the treeline, allowing the infantry to clear it. But speed was life in the bocage. If there was an enemy tank in that hedgerow, stopping meant presenting a stationary target. The lead Sherman was still 200 yards from the treeline when the German Panther opened fire. The range was close enough that even a moving target should have been an easy kill for a skilled crew, but the Panther's shot missed high, the shell screaming over the Sherman's turret and detonating in the field behind. The German gunner had misjudged the Sherman's speed and trajectory, and now he needed several precious seconds to reload and reacquire his target. Those seconds were all the Americans needed. The Sherman's gunner, operating with his stabilizer engaged, tracked the flash of the Panther's muzzle through his sight. The Sherman was still moving at nearly 20 miles per hour, its suspension compressing and extending as it crossed the uneven ground, but the gun barrel remained steady. The gunner made a minor adjustment for lead and range, then fired. The 75mm armor-piercing shell struck the Panther's gun mantlet, penetrating into the turret. Smoke began pouring from the German tank's hatches. 3 crew members bailed out and ran for the cover of the hedgerow. The entire engagement, from the Panther's first shot to its destruction, lasted less than 15 seconds. The Sherman had never stopped moving. This pattern repeated itself across dozens of engagements in the weeks following the invasion. American tank crews who trusted their stabilizers and fought aggressively found they could seize initiative even against technically superior German armor. German after-action reports began to reflect confusion and frustration. Panzer commanders described being engaged by American tanks that fired accurately while advancing, something that should not have been possible. Some German officers attributed this to reckless American tactics, firing wildly while moving and occasionally getting lucky. Others theorized that American crews were simply more willing to take risks, accepting lower hit probabilities in exchange for maintaining momentum. A few reports suggested the Americans might have developed some kind of improved sighting system, but these speculations never coalesced into a coherent understanding of what the Allies actually possessed. German intelligence analysts, overwhelmed with more pressing concerns like Allied air superiority and the ongoing collapse of Army Group Center on the Eastern Front, filed away these reports without conducting the kind of systematic analysis that might have revealed the truth. The invisibility of the stabilizer was its greatest asset. From outside the tank, there was no way to tell whether a Sherman had a functioning stabilizer or not. The device was entirely internal, producing no visible signature. A German tank commander observing a Sherman through his optics saw what appeared to be a standard M4 tank, identical to hundreds of others. Nothing about its external appearance hinted at the technology hidden inside its turret. This meant that German tactical responses evolved to counter American aggression and numerical superiority rather than to neutralize a specific technical advantage they did not know existed. If German intelligence had understood that American tanks possessed stabilized guns, they might have developed tactics to exploit the system's limitations. Engaging at ranges beyond 1,000 yards, where the stabilizer's effectiveness diminished, could have negated much of its advantage. Focusing on lateral movement that forced American gunners to traverse manually without stabilization assistance might also have helped. But because the Germans never understood what they faced, they never developed these countermeasures. They continued to fight American armor using tactics designed for conventional tank warfare, and those tactics were increasingly inadequate. The human dimension of this technological advantage played out in countless individual moments of survival and tragedy. In a wheat field east of St. Lo in mid-July, a Sherman commanded by a sergeant from Ohio found itself facing 2 German Mark IV tanks emerging from a sunken road less than 400 yards away. The Germans had the advantage of surprise and firing position. By conventional doctrine, the Sherman should have been destroyed within seconds. But the sergeant had learned to trust his stabilizer and his crew. Instead of attempting to stop and return fire, he ordered his driver to accelerate toward the nearest cover, a low stone wall to their left. While the tank surged forward, the gunner kept his sight on the lead Mark IV and fired. The first shot missed, passing just ahead of the German tank. The gunner adjusted, leading the target slightly more to account for both tanks' motion. The second shot, fired while the Sherman was still accelerating, struck the Mark IV's hull, penetrating the thinner side armor. The German tank lurched to a halt, its crew abandoning the vehicle. The second Mark IV, seeing its companion destroyed, reversed back into the sunken road and withdrew. The sergeant and his crew reached the stone wall and took up a defensive position. None of them had been wounded. The sergeant later told an army historian that he credited the stabilizer with saving his crew's life. Without it, he said, they would have been forced to stop and fight a stationary duel against two enemies who had already targeted them. The outcome would likely have been very different. Not every engagement ended in American success. The stabilizer was not a miracle device that guaranteed victory. German tanks still possessed significant advantages in armor protection and gun penetration. A Panther or Tiger that achieved a first-round hit on a Sherman at medium range could destroy it regardless of whether the Sherman's gun was stabilized or not. The stabilizer's value was in shifting probabilities, in giving American crews a meaningful chance to engage effectively in situations where they would otherwise have been at a severe disadvantage. It was about reducing the number of times American tanks had to present themselves as stationary targets, and about enabling them to shoot first in meeting engagements where both sides spotted each other simultaneously. These advantages accumulated across hundreds of engagements, saving lives and helping American armored units maintain momentum in their advance across France. But they came at a cost in maintenance and reliability that sometimes frustrated the crews who depended on the system. The gyrostabilizer was a precision instrument operating in one of the harshest environments imaginable. The constant vibration, shock, and jarring of tank operations subjected the gyroscope bearings and hydraulic seals to tremendous stress. Dust and mud infiltrated the mechanism despite protective seals. Hard impacts from rough terrain or near-miss explosions could knock the gyroscope assembly out of alignment, causing the stabilizer to malfunction or fail completely. Tank crews were supposed to inspect and service the stabilizer daily, checking oil levels, cleaning filters, and verifying that the gyroscope spun up properly when the tank's electrical system was activated. In garrison or during quiet periods, maintenance crews could usually keep the stabilizers functioning. But during sustained combat operations, when tanks operated continuously for days or weeks with minimal opportunity for proper maintenance, stabilizer functionality degraded. Maintenance records from American armored divisions in France during the summer of 1944 show that stabilizer operational readiness varied significantly, ranging from highs of 85% in units that prioritized maintenance to lows of 60% in units engaged in intense combat. When a stabilizer failed, the crew could disengage it and operate the gun manually, returning to conventional unstabilized gunnery. This meant a broken stabilizer did not render a tank ineffective, but it did eliminate the tactical advantage the system provided. Crew attitudes toward the stabilizer varied widely. Some tank commanders became vocal advocates, insisting that their units maintain and use the system aggressively. They had seen firsthand how the stabilizer enabled tactics that kept their crews alive. They pushed back against skeptics and ensured their maintenance personnel prioritized stabilizer repairs. Other commanders remained ambivalent, or even hostile toward the device. Some viewed it as an unnecessary complication, another mechanical system that could break down and require maintenance that might be better spent on more critical components. A few continued to distrust the concept of firing while moving, believing that careful, aimed shots from a stationary position remained the most reliable path to success. This diversity of opinion meant that the stabilizer's impact on American armored operations was uneven, highly dependent on unit culture and leadership attitudes. Units that embraced the technology tended to suffer fewer casualties and advance more rapidly. Units that ignored or underutilized it fought much as tanks had always fought, with all the vulnerabilities that traditional tactics entailed. By the autumn of 1944, as Allied forces pushed eastward across France and into the Low Countries, German resistance was stiffening. The Wehrmacht, though battered and retreating, fought with increasing desperation as the battleground moved closer to the German homeland. Panzer divisions, reinforced with new Tiger II heavy tanks and Jagdpanther tank destroyers, launched local counterattacks intended to slow the Allied advance and buy time for Germany to prepare defensive positions along the Rhine. These engagements took place in terrain that favored the defender, towns, forests, and river crossings where German forces could establish killing zones and force American armor to advance into prepared ambushes. In this environment, the stabilizer's advantages became even more pronounced. American tank crews advancing through a contested town, moving from intersection to intersection while covering each other, could engage German anti-tank positions without stopping. This enabled a pace of advance that kept German defenders off balance, unable to establish the kind of methodical, set-piece defenses they preferred. In the forests of the Hurtgen along the German border, where visibility was measured in tens of yards and engagements happened at point-blank range, the stabilizer proved particularly valuable. A Sherman could advance along a forest track, gun oriented toward the most likely threat direction, and fire the instant an enemy position was identified without needing to halt and expose itself. This capability was life-saving in an environment where the first tank to fire often won the engagement. German troops defending in the Hurtgen described facing American armor that seemed relentless, pressing forward and firing constantly without the pauses they had learned to exploit. They did not understand that the Americans had found a way to maintain accuracy while maintaining movement, violating what every tanker had been taught about the fundamentals of gunnery. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 tested American armored forces under the worst possible conditions: winter weather, surprise attack, and initial numerical inferiority against a German offensive that sought to split Allied lines and capture the vital port of Antwerp. In the early days of the offensive, German Panzer and Panzer Grenadier divisions achieved significant breakthroughs, surrounding American units and creating pockets of resistance throughout the Ardennes. American tank battalions rushed into the battle found themselves fighting desperate defensive actions, often outnumbered and outgunned. In these circumstances, every tactical advantage mattered. Shermans defending road junctions and villages used their stabilizers to engage German armor approaching through the snow and fog, taking shots on the move as they repositioned between defensive positions. The stabilizer could not overcome the fundamental challenges American forces faced. They were surprised, dispersed, and fighting in appalling weather. But it gave individual tank crews options they would not otherwise have had: the ability to trade space for time by moving and fighting simultaneously rather than being forced to stand and fight from static positions. One engagement near Bastogne illustrated both the potential and the limitations of the stabilizer under extreme conditions. A platoon of 4 Shermans from the 10th Armored Division was assigned to hold the crossroads on the southern approach to the besieged town. German forces had been probing the position for 2 days, and intelligence indicated a major attack was imminent. On the morning of December 22, through heavy snow, a column of German armor appeared, Panthers and Mark IVs supported by infantry. The American platoon leader, a captain who had fought across France, knew his position was untenable. 4 Shermans could not hold against a company-strength attack. But falling back would expose other American positions and potentially open a route into Bastogne. He decided to fight a delaying action, using movement and the stabilizer to maximize the time his platoon could contest the crossroads. As the German tanks advanced, the Shermans began a fighting withdrawal, moving from position to position while engaging targets. The stabilizers allowed them to fire while repositioning, forcing the German armor to take cover and proceed cautiously rather than advancing in a rapid assault. For nearly 40 minutes, the 4 Shermans traded shots with the German column, knocking out 2 Panthers and damaging several other vehicles. Eventually, the Germans brought up assault guns and began systematically destroying the American positions. The captain ordered his remaining tanks to fall back. 2 Shermans made it out. The other 2 were destroyed, their crews killed or captured. The Germans took the crossroads, but 40 minutes later than their timetable had planned. Those 40 minutes allowed other American units to reposition and establish a stronger defensive line further back. The captain survived the war and later reflected on that engagement in an interview with Army historians. He believed his platoon's ability to fight while moving had made the difference between a 40-minute delay and being overrun in 10 minutes. He could not know whether those extra 30 minutes had any strategic impact, whether they contributed meaningfully to the eventual American victory at Bastogne. But he knew they had given him and his crews options. They had allowed him to choose how and where to fight rather than being forced to die in place. That sense of agency, of having some control even in an impossible situation, mattered to the men who fought in those tanks. It mattered psychologically, and psychology is a dimension of warfare as real as armor thickness or gun caliber. As 1944 turned to 1945 and Allied forces prepared to cross the Rhine and drive into the heart of Germany, the character of tank warfare evolved. German armored forces, severely depleted by years of attrition and crippling fuel shortages, increasingly operated in small groups or individually, supporting infantry defense rather than conducting mobile operations. American armored divisions, by contrast, had evolved into sophisticated combined arms forces, integrating tanks, infantry, artillery, and air support with a level of coordination that German forces could no longer match. In this environment, the stabilizer remained useful but less decisive than it had been during the mobile battles of France. Many engagements now involved tanks operating in direct support of infantry assaults on fortified positions, where movement was constrained and firing was often at stationary, hardened targets. The stabilizer still provided value in these scenarios, reducing the time needed to engage targets and allowing tanks to reposition under fire. But it was one advantage among many rather than a defining capability. Maintenance challenges intensified as American tank units drove deeper into Germany. Supply lines stretched hundreds of miles, and spare parts for complex systems like the stabilizer sometimes took weeks to reach forward units. Many tanks continued operating with degraded or non-functional stabilizers, their crews reverting to conventional gunnery techniques. By April 1945, maintenance records suggest that operational stabilizers in some units had fallen to below 50%. The war was nearly won by this point, and the question of stabilizer effectiveness had become less critical than simply maintaining enough operational tanks to continue the advance. Some maintenance crews, overwhelmed by the volume of repairs needed and struggling with limited parts, prioritized engine, transmission, and weapon repairs over restoring stabilizer functionality. A tank with a broken stabilizer could still fight. A tank with a broken engine could not move. These pragmatic triage decisions meant that by the war's end, many American tanks were fighting without the advantage that had proven so valuable during the breakthrough battles of 1944. The Pacific Theater presented a different set of challenges and opportunities for stabilized gunnery. Japanese tank designs lagged significantly behind those of Germany and the Western Allies, meaning that tank versus tank combat was rare and usually one-sided when it occurred. American Shermans faced their most serious threats from well-concealed anti-tank guns and fortified positions rather than from enemy armor. In this environment, the stabilizer's value came primarily from its ability to enable effective fire while traversing difficult terrain. The volcanic soil of Iwo Jima, the mud of Okinawa, and the jungle trails of the Philippines created conditions where maintaining aim from a stationary position was difficult enough. Doing so while moving was nearly impossible without stabilization. Marine Corps Sherman crews supporting infantry assaults against Japanese defensive positions used their stabilizers to maintain continuous suppressive fire while advancing, helping to keep enemy defenders pinned down and unable to effectively target the accompanying infantry. This represented a different application of the technology than the tank duels of Europe, but it was no less valuable to the Marines whose lives depended on effective fire support. Throughout the war, the stabilizer remained classified, and German intelligence never developed a clear understanding of what American tanks possessed. Interrogations of captured American tank crewmen occasionally touched on the subject, with some prisoners mentioning a device that helped with aiming while moving, but these references were fragmentary and never pursued systematically. German technical intelligence teams had opportunities to examine captured or abandoned Shermans, and some of these examinations may have noted the presence of the stabilizer mechanism. But by 1944 and 1945, German intelligence resources were overwhelmed by more immediate concerns. The Reich was being invaded from east and west, its cities were being destroyed by strategic bombing, and its economy was collapsing. The question of whether American tanks had some kind of gun stabilization system was simply not a priority when the larger question was whether Germany could continue fighting at all. After the war, when German tank commanders learned about the stabilizer during Allied debriefings, many expressed surprise. Some acknowledged that such a device would explain certain phenomena they had witnessed but could not account for. Others remained skeptical, suggesting that even if the Americans had such technology, it probably did not work very well under actual combat conditions. These varied responses reflected both the human tendency to rationalize outcomes and the genuine difficulty of assessing a technology one has never seen or used. The legacy of the World War II gyrostabilizer extended far beyond the war itself. In the immediate post-war period, as the major powers assessed the lessons of armored warfare, gun stabilization emerged as a critical technology that all future tank designs would need to incorporate. The British, who had received American Shermans through Lend-Lease and had observed the stabilizer in action, developed their own two-axis stabilization system for the Centurion tank, which entered service in 1945. The Centurion stabilizer was more sophisticated than the Shermans, providing stabilization in both vertical and horizontal axes, and it set a new standard for fire control effectiveness. Soviet tank designers, initially skeptical of stabilization as an overcomplicated Western approach, eventually recognized its value and began incorporating stabilizers into their designs in the 1950s. The T-54 and T-55 tanks that formed the backbone of Soviet armored forces during the Cold War featured stabilization systems that owed their conceptual origins to the technology the Americans had pioneered. American tank development continued along the path the stabilizer had opened. The M26 Pershing heavy tank, which saw limited service at the end of World War II, featured an improved stabilizer. The M48 Patton of the 1950s incorporated even more advanced fire control systems, and by the time the M60 entered service in 1960, American tanks featured sophisticated stabilization integrated with ballistic computers and laser rangefinders. Each generation built upon the lessons learned from the original gun stabilizer M1, refining the concept and extending its capabilities. By the 1980s, when the M1 Abrams entered service, fire-on-the-move capability had become so fundamental to tank design that it was taken for granted. Modern main battle tanks can engage targets accurately at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters while traveling at speeds of 40 miles per hour or more, a capability that would have seemed like science fiction to the Sherman crews of 1944. But the principle remains the same: use gyroscopic or electronic sensors to detect gun movement, and use hydraulic or electric actuators to compensate. The technology has become vastly more sophisticated, but its roots trace directly back to that spinning gyroscope in a Sherman turret. The human stories of the men who fought in those Shermans deserve remembrance alongside the technical narrative. These were not professional soldiers in most cases. They were civilians, farm boys and city kids, who had been handed a crash course in armored warfare and sent to fight in a global conflict. They climbed into steel boxes that could become furnaces if hit, entrusting their lives to mechanical systems they often did not fully understand and to crew members they might have known for only weeks or months. The stabilizer was one piece of the complex machinery they depended on, and like every other system in the tank, it worked until it didn't. When it worked, it gave them a chance. When it failed, they adapted and continued fighting with whatever capabilities remained. Their courage was not diminished by the technology they possessed. If anything, the stabilizer is a testament to the fact that courage alone is not enough, that soldiers deserve every advantage that engineering and industry can provide, every edge that might help them survive and accomplish their mission. The men who designed and built the stabilizer were also part of this story, though their names are largely forgotten. The Westinghouse engineers who solved the technical challenges of making a precision instrument function in the brutal environment of combat, the factory workers who manufactured thousands of these devices under wartime production schedules, the technicians at Aberdeen Proving Ground who tested and refined the system, all of them contributed to a capability that saved lives. They never fired a shot in anger, but their work influenced the outcome of battles across 2 continents. This is a different kind of service, less visible and less celebrated, but no less essential to victory. Today, the Gyrostabilizer's story serves as a reminder that technological advantage in warfare is often cumulative rather than decisive. There was no single weapon or invention that won World War II for the Allies. Victory came from the combination of countless factors: industrial capacity, strategic vision, tactical innovation, alliance coordination, intelligence advantages, and the courage of millions of individuals who fought and sacrificed. The stabilizer was one thread in this vast tapestry, important but not determinative. Its significance lies in what it represents: the advantage of innovation, the value of engineering excellence, and the importance of giving soldiers tools that increase their effectiveness and their chances of survival. It reminds us that war is not only a contest of wills but also a contest of systems, and that small improvements in capability, multiplied across thousands of engagements, can accumulate into strategic effects. The fact that German forces never fully understood what they faced adds a final dimension to the story. In warfare, perception matters almost as much as reality. An advantage the enemy knows about can be countered. An advantage the enemy does not know about continues to provide benefit until discovered. The stabilizer's invisibility extended its usefulness throughout the war, shaping outcomes without ever becoming a factor that German commanders could account for in their planning. This speaks to the value of operational security and the importance of protecting technological innovations until their deployment is so widespread that concealment no longer matters. By the time the war ended and the stabilizer's existence became public knowledge, the question of its effectiveness was already answered. It had proven itself in combat, and the nations that had not possessed it were developing their own versions. When we remember the tank battles of World War II, we remember the clash of steel and fire, the courage of crews who fought in conditions of unimaginable stress and danger, the tactical brilliance of commanders who maneuvered their forces across contested ground. These memories are true and important. But alongside them should be the memory of a device that most people never saw and many never knew existed: a spinning gyroscope connected to hydraulic lines and electrical circuits, constantly making tiny corrections to keep a gun barrel steady while the world shook and burned around it. That device, and the men who built it, and the men who trusted it in combat, deserve their place in the history of how the war was won. Not because the stabilizer was magic or because it guaranteed victory, but because it represented the kind of advantage that accumulates into success, small, invisible, but real. In the summer of 1944, in the fields and towns of France, American tank crews rolled forward into battle with a capability their enemy did not know to fear. And that made all the difference.